My name is Joshua Jimenez, and I am an internal medicine physician in upstate New York. I currently work for Family Care Medical Group, but I recently completed my residency at SUNY Upstate. And like Dr. Gambier was saying, I do work hospice weeks between Upstate downtown campus and community campus. So the goal of this presentation is to guide you through personal finance as it pertains to our profession specifically. First off, I'm not a financial advisor, and the content of this presentation is for educational purposes only. I have no financial disclosure or conflicts of interest with the material in this presentation. I will start by teaching you how to build a foundation for good money habits by way of budgeting and debt management. Then I will discuss the importance of protecting your biggest asset with the right insurance. And I don't mean car insurance, just like that icon indicates there. And then finally, I will talk about saving for retirement, reaching financial independence, and a basic investing strategy as well. So let's begin with budgeting. So I originally gave this talk as my capstone presentation with one of my friends and colleagues as PGY3s. We sent a poll out to our program and received responses for a lot of personal finance related questions. In this talk, I will show and discuss some of these results to highlight some of my points. One of the first questions asked if people had defined budgets, and 61% of people said no. This is why I start here. Every road to financial independence starts with a good budget. So why do you need one? We receive our paychecks, usually on a bi-weekly basis, which is our amount after taxes and benefits have been accounted for. This amount then gets split between living expenses, entertainment, and savings. Without a defined budget, we wouldn't know how much is an appropriate amount to be putting into each of these categories based on our salaries. And if that's the case, often one of the categories shrinks, and you can guess that it's the savings that usually does. There are some budget rules out there, and this is the one I usually refer to. It's called the 50-30-20 rule. What this means is that 50% of your take-home salary should go towards paying for needs, 30% should go towards wants, and 20% should be for savings and debt repayment. If you are a resident and haven't already started to look at your budget, you'll find that it may be very difficult to stick to this. I know when I was a resident, I actually flexed this rule to about 65% needs, 20% wants, and 15% savings, since all of my living expenses were already at 65% of my take-home salary. The important part is to have a rule that includes all three categories, and it's important that you stick to it. So the needs section includes housing and utilities, food and groceries, insurance, which we'll talk about later in this discussion, healthcare, cars, cell phones, and minimum debt repayments. You'll notice that minimum debt repayment is in this section as we can't avoid the minimum payments on our loans. In the savings and debt repayment section, we have retirement savings in the form of 401ks and 403b contributions, and then IRA contributions, which we will talk about in detail. Extra debt repayment and building an emergency fund are also important parts of this section. The wants section includes everything else. Whether you like to travel, dine out, spend on entertainment, or clothing, that all falls under this section. For those of you who know me well, this is where the funds for my golf clubs and speakers come from. Now let's talk about emergency funds. An emergency fund is a financial safety net for future mishaps and or unexpected expenses, and should be about 3 to 6 months of living expenses. And for those of you in my position, starting a new job after residency, this fund is very important because it may be a while before you get your first paycheck. I'm currently still living off my emergency fund that I built up during my residency. And so going back to the poll, about half of the group, when polled, said that they did not have an emergency fund. And so why do you need one? Well, it creates a financial buffer to keep you afloat in a time of need. You should not have to rely on high interest credit cards or loans. There are a couple ways to build one. And the couple that I mentioned here are to save your tax returns to build up your fund, or to save a small percentage of income monthly until it is sufficient. And remember that this would count under your 20% savings part of your budget. It's really tempting to spend your tax returns on other things because you think it's free money that the government gives you back. But using discipline to save them to build up this emergency fund is probably a better use of that money. And then now the question is, where should you keep it? You should keep it in an account where funds are easily accessible or liquidated. And these include high yield savings accounts, money market accounts, certificates of deposit. I also threw in a wild card here with the Roth IRA, which we will talk about later. Now let's discuss debt, which is every physician's favorite topic. Here's just a few types of debt that most of us likely have, which includes credit card, student loans, car loans, mortgages, and even personal loans. And I'll go into each of these in detail. We'll start with credit card debt. We all like to talk about how high our credit limits are on our cards. The problem is that doing that encourages us to spend up to the limit. Do not fall into this trap. This is why many people have numerous cards carrying balances from month to month. And this could potentially drown you in debt because the average interest is 18%. Imagine if your student loans or any other loans that you had, imagine if they were at 18%. Therefore, this is one of the ones you should pay off ASAP if you have it. I don't want to scare you away from using credit cards, though. They are actually extremely useful and beneficial if used properly. By that, I mean that you should pay off your entire balance each month on time. Do not use more than 30% of your total available credit at any time. I actually just checked mine yesterday to make sure that I was following my own advice, and I found that I'm using only 5% of my available credit balance. You should also keep your cards open even when they are not in use, assuming that you don't pay annual fees for these cards. And this is because that the length of your credit history is very important to your credit score. Personally, my oldest card open is actually 22 years old, thanks to my dad who opened an account for me, which is no longer in use. But since there are no fees on that account, I've kept it open and it actually helps my credit score. But what if you already have a very large balance? What you can do is pay more than the minimum amount, which would count towards your 20% savings and debt repayment part of your budget. Now moving on to student loans, which is our favorite. Many of us haven't made payments on these in a long time. I want to take this time to thank Biden for extending the pause once again. This is most likely your largest balance. As residents, you should apply for an income-driven repayment plan such as Repay or Pay, which is pay as you earn for federal loans. Private loans, on the other hand, should be refinanced for lower interest rates if possible. Try to avoid deferring your payments completely, though, as this allows a lot of interest to accrue before starting payments and really gets you behind the 8 ball. What you do after residency depends on your future employer. If you are working for a qualified employer, pursue Public Service Loan Forgiveness, or PSLF. With that, after 10 years of qualified payments, or 120 payments, the remainder of your loans will be forgiven. If PSLF is not an option, you should refinance your loans and pay them off quickly. And I put a key point here. If your investments are doing better than your loan interest rate, it is better to use your money investing, which means that you should make the minimum payment on your loans. But that is only if your investments are doing better than your loan interest rate. Say if your loan interest rate is high, about 7%, you can't expect that your investments will always beat 7%. So it might be better to pay down your loans in that case. Car loans are straightforward. Don't buy more car than you can afford. And I guess the rule for this, it's a pretty soft rule, but no more than 10% of your monthly take home should go towards your car payment. But for those of us who love cars, such as myself, it may be tempting to buy that expensive car as soon as you become an attending. But I'm here to tell you that you should make sure your finances are in order first and your debt is well managed before doing something like that. One of my friends and now colleagues owns a car just like the one you see here. It's a beautiful Porsche Taycan. But I have to mention that he has been in attending for longer than I have. He was very aggressive with his loan payments out of residency, and he made very good financial decisions to put himself in a position to comfortably buy one of these. And this is the beauty of budgeting and financial literacy. Now we'll switch gears to mortgages. This is considered a good debt because it is long-term, it shows financial stability, and requires responsible credit use. It can set you up for some tax breaks. It will likely gain value over time and allows a return on investment. I was lucky that I purchased my house in 2019 before the market blew up like it has. And now I could sell it for much more, although I probably will try to turn it into a rental property rather than selling it. If your goal is to venture into real estate, like mine is, you'll need to have a lot of experience with mortgages. I know I threw a lot of information at you, but just to summarize, make a budget now. Know where every one of your dollars is going. Start an emergency fund, pay down high interest debt, and live like a resident. Stick to a budget, use extra income to pay down debt, and build your net worth. Establishing these habits now will set you up for early financial independence. Now let's discuss insurance. Remember that your most valuable asset is your ability to work and earn a salary. Disability insurance will pay you in the unfortunate situation where you are not able to work due to a disability. You would receive a predetermined amount if you meet the definition of disabled as outlined in your plan. Most workplaces do offer it, but it's usually with limited coverage. Many people think that workplace disability is good enough, but the reality is that these plans often provide less benefit with weaker definitions of disability, meaning that it's tougher to qualify for payments. I encourage you to examine your employer's plan carefully and to consider an individual plan if what you find isn't good enough. And just to note that 1 in 7 doctors end up having to use disability, and so that's why I'm emphasizing disability insurance. These are some important terms to know when looking for disability insurance. Own occupation is a type that covers you if you're unable to perform the majority of duties that you are trained to perform. In other words, if you are unable to work as a physician, even if you can work a different type of job that maybe pays just as well as a doctor, you will be paid for the job you're unable to do. This makes sense because as physicians, we all spent many years of our lives training for one thing. And if something happens preventing us from working, were those years just a waste? So that's why it's so important to think about disability insurance as being a crucial part of your budget. A benefit period, though, just notes when payments start and end, and usually they go to age 65 or 67, just depends on the plan. And then partial versus full disability, each plan is different. Be sure to read through this to know if you would be covered for partial disability. And I would speak to a professional about this as you're shopping around for plans. You might see the term riders when you're shopping around for disability insurance. What those are additional features of a policy that usually cost an additional premium. I listed a few important ones here to make sure they're in your own plan, but inflation protection is a cost of living adjustment. The amount paid increases by a small percentage every year just to combat inflation. The future purchase option is important for residents. So if you're already attending or shopping around for disability insurance, this isn't important for you. But if you're a resident, The future purchase option allows you to buy more coverage without a repeat exam. So it essentially means that you can get disability insurance cheap as a resident, and then it's cheaper to buy extra coverage when you become an attending. Non-cancelable and guaranteed renewable are self-explanatory. I recommend getting disability insurance as soon as possible. And I would say ideally before becoming an attending, because at that point it's cheaper. And like I said before, just make sure it has the future purchase option. In terms of how much you need, residents usually buy about $5,000 a month benefit, while attendings should probably buy $10,000 to $15,000 of benefit. And then just an idea of price-wise, for a benefit of $10,000 a month, expect to spend $300 to $500 a month. Just also for reference, when I was a resident, I bought $5,000 a month benefit throughout all of residency, and I paid about $120 a month. So it is a lot cheaper as a resident. Now switching gears to life insurance, which is a legally binding contract that pays a death benefit when the insured dies. The money will go to your named beneficiaries. And life insurance is an absolute must if someone else depends on your income. So I recommend this to anyone who has a family and people who are depending on your income. The main types of life insurance are term and whole. Term is simply insurance only. It covers for a term, usually 20 to 30 years. It's cheaper than whole. So the average 30-year-old can get a 20-year term policy with a $500,000 death benefit for about $25 a month. So this is actually much cheaper than your disability plan. Whole life, on the other hand, is permanent. It never expires unless you stop making payments on that plan. It also has cash value and can be borrowed against as a loan. Usually the loan interest rate will be about 5%. So a lot of times if you need money in a pinch, you can't get a good interest rate on the loan from a bank or another borrower or lender, you can borrow against your whole life insurance plan. The cash value here grows tax deferred, but it's only often like 1% to 2% annually. So it's not a crazy growth rate, but it is guaranteed as a growth rate. More expensive than term as well. So you can see that whole does a little bit more for you, and it's not crazy to see why it's more expensive. Generally though, term is the way to go, although whole life can have its benefits. Just don't get misled into thinking that whole life is perfect, because it's also an investment vehicle, as the growth doesn't match what you can do in other accounts. So say you use that money instead and invest it in the stock market or something, you can probably do much better than 1% to 2% annually. So if someone's trying to sell you whole life insurance and saying that it's, guaranteed growth 1% to 2%, you can probably turn them away and say that I can probably do better elsewhere. But finally, we should talk about retirement. You might be thinking, but Josh, you just started work as an attending. Why are you talking about retirement already? I assure you, it isn't because I don't like my job, but it's the fact that everyone should be thinking about their future financial security, and the earlier you think about it, the better. So back to the poll. When I sent this out originally, more than a quarter of those who responded said that they were not saving for retirement. It may be tough as residents, but it is crucial to set aside something for the future. And then we asked if people were aware of the types of accounts that they held. What these results showed me is that many aren't aware of the options, as evidenced by the almost 35% of people who said, I have absolutely no idea. I won't discuss pensions here, as they are really being phased out. Most employers aren't offering them anymore, but I will talk about everything else on this page. So that would be 401k, 403b, Roth IRA, traditional IRA, and 457. And I will also tell you which ones you should have or when you should have them. Retirement plans also depend on when you'd like to retire. Historically, 65 plus has been the most common response, but there are certain groups who target much earlier ages, and I will introduce a small subset of that group in a few slides. So why should you save for retirement now? Why start now? And the answer is compound interest. The most important thing about saving for retirement or investing long-term is time in the market. I like to say that the best day to start saving for retirement was yesterday. And that's not to make you feel bad, but it's to emphasize that you should start right now. And so how much should you be saving? As a general target, you should aim to save 10 times your salary by age 67. Keep in mind that the earlier you start saving, the lower your savings rate needs to be. So if you look at this, if you started at age 25, you would only need 15% of a savings rate annually. But if you look at the difference, if you start 10 years later, you need to save 23% yearly, which is a significant difference. So like I mentioned on one of the previous slides there, I wanted to introduce the concept of FIRE, which stands for financial independence, retire early, or at least a lot earlier than the man with the cane you see there. It is a movement of extreme savings and investment that aims to allow someone to retire far earlier than normal, often as early as 40, and I've even seen in their 30s. Savings rates are through the roof though, and can be up to 70% of annual income. Imagine that there are people out there living on only 30% of their salaries. They live off small withdrawals from these funds that they've saved. Now, I just want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that people do this. I know that I certainly don't plan on doing it, but it may be something that interests you. Why should you use these retirement accounts? Why can't you just save it in a checking account, in a savings account? And the answer to that is taxes. Retirement accounts have tax benefits. Your salary is taxed before you receive an amount. So what you're receiving is actually post-tax. If you invest that money, you will have to pay taxes when you withdraw. And you should think about this as being taxed twice. So just to highlight an example here, you have your gross salary, and then taxes, benefits, payroll deductions are all removed. This leaves you with a take-home amount, which you can invest, you can save, but then if you put it into an investment account, a normal investment account, the gains are taxed and then removed, and then what you're left with is a nest egg that is less than what it could be if you somehow avoided taxes at one of these steps. And then you feel like this man. So how do you get a tax benefit? By using these types of accounts. So tax deferred accounts take pre-tax dollars, so it comes right out of your gross salary, and you are not taxed on this money. And when that happens, it technically lowers your taxable income. However, when you withdraw from them in retirement, the amount is taxed as income. So examples of this are a traditional IRA, which we'll talk about, 401k, 403b. On the other side here, you have tax exempt accounts, which take after tax dollars. So if you have your gross salary, you would pay taxes on all of that. And then what you have left is your take home. But then you'd use those take home dollars to put into this type of tax exempt account. So as you can see, it didn't lower the taxes that you pay now. However, the advantage to this account is that when you withdraw it after it's grown over time, those withdrawals are tax-free. And the example of this would be a Roth IRA. And I kept the two on the same sides here. So the tax-deferred side is the left side. Traditional IRA is exactly what I was referring to. Contributions can be deducted from taxes at filing, but in general, physicians make too much to qualify for these deductions. Withdrawals in these accounts are then taxed as income. So a traditional IRA is generally not recommended for physicians, except for only one instance, which I will discuss in a few slides. On the other side, a Roth is that tax exempt count that I was talking about. So you have your entire gross salary, you pay taxes on the entire thing, and then you decide after you get your take-home amount that you want to put money into this Roth IRA, which is technically after-tax dollars. But then as that grows over time, and then you decide to take it out in retirement, your withdrawals are tax-free. Now that I have your interest in these accounts, let's talk more about a Roth and why it's the most important one for residents. Like I've said, a Roth IRA is an individual retirement account that takes after-tax money, which you can invest how you wish, and you can remove tax-free once you reach 59 and a half. It is best for those whose marginal taxes will be higher in retirement than they are now, which is exactly the position a resident is in. Residents are guaranteed to make more money later in life. I can say that with confidence. So paying taxes now on a low resident salary makes more sense when the money can then grow without needing to be taxed again. When you think about it the other way, it's in contrast to saving on the taxes now by putting pre-tax dollars in, lowering your pre-tax or lowering your taxable income, but then having to pay taxes on the money later on when your salary is much higher. And you might be thinking also that, when you're retired, if you pull out this money, it's technically taxed on the amount you're pulling, or like in relation to how much you make a year, or how much total you're taking a year. And you might think that maybe you'll live on a resident salary later on. The reality of it is that you're probably not going to be pulling out only $60,000 out of your retirement accounts every year when you're in retirement. You've probably gotten used to living a much higher, standard of life. And $60,000 may not be enough to cover what you're already used to paying for. So that is why I am confident when I say that, you are probably going to be making less now than even you will be making in retirement when you're pulling your money out. And then if you recall, I listed the Roth IRA as a potential place to keep an emergency fund. And the reason for this is that you can actually pull your contributions from your Roth, but not the gains, without penalty. So if you contributed, say, $4,000 to your Roth, and you did well on your investments, made $1,000, and you needed money in a pinch, you can pull the original $4,000, but you can't pull the gains that you made. So that's why in the emergency fund slide, I said that technically you could use a Roth IRA as a potential place for an emergency fund. A Roth isn't perfect though. Income must be less than $144,000 for single filers, or $214,000 for those married filing jointly. And the contribution limit is $6,000 a year. But if you are age 50 or older, the limit is $7,000. And that's what they call a catch-up contribution, by allowing you to contribute an additional $1,000 a year. What if you are an attending though, and you make more than the limit? Then a backdoor Roth IRA option is for you. This may be tough to see, but it is a step-by-step guide to performing a backdoor Roth. It sounds illegal, but it isn't, at least for now, but that may change in the next couple of years. This is the only time you should open a traditional IRA as a physician. And I repeat, this is the only time you should open a traditional IRA as a physician. But the way it works is that you contribute to a traditional IRA, and then you transfer or convert the money. It's the same process, transfer, convert the money into a Roth IRA. And this works because you've already paid taxes on the money that you were using to put into the traditional IRA. So it's already after-tax money. And when you convert it to a Roth, there are no taxes that are due in that transaction, which means that your after-tax money will then be moved into a Roth account, which is a tax exempt account, and will be left to grow there tax-free. So I actually did this for the first time this year. And it does take a few days for the money to clear, but it's a relatively simple process, and it's a way to get around the income limit and continue contributing to these accounts. And here's an example Roth. It's actually my example Roth. So I put my own values into a calculator. I already have about 24K in my Roth. And by age 67, I should have about 1.08 million of tax-free money. And this is calculated with an average rate of return of only 6%. However, if you invest well, average rates of return are closer to 10%, which would drastically increase this number. And actually, when I didn't screenshot it, but when I did it at 10%, it was actually $3.5 million. So there's a huge difference here. And that's why these accounts are super important. Therefore, you should start a Roth as soon as possible to take advantage of compound interest. Take advantage of the market right now by throwing in money. It is a fantastic time to throw in money to the market. If you have extra lying around, just throw it into one of these types of accounts and watch it grow over years. It'll be worth a lot more by the time you need the money. So I'm going to take a quick break from retirement accounts and give you all a brief introduction to investing, or at least the way I invest. When you invest the money in your IRA, you can choose any fund, and that's the beauty of individual retirement accounts. A stock, though, we'll start from the basics, is a security that represents the ownership of a fraction of a company. Take Tesla, for example. If you buy a share of Tesla, you own something that represents a fraction of the company. When Tesla does well, your holding will gain in value, and vice versa. A mutual fund, though, is a financial vehicle that pools assets from shareholders to invest in securities such as stocks, bonds, etc. It is professionally managed, and this means it costs extra to hold or own. But it gives investors access to diversified portfolios, because by buying a fund, you hold a small fraction of multiple companies. You've probably heard of the S&P 500. If you buy a fund like that, you would own fractions of a share of 500 of the leading traded companies in the US. An index fund is a specific type of mutual fund that is passively managed, therefore making it cheaper to own and hold. And then you have ETFs, which are like mutual funds in that they're a pooled basket of stocks or bonds. The difference between an ETF and a mutual fund, though, is that it can be traded during the day. And then finally, we have bonds, which are fixed income instruments that represent a loan made by an investor to a borrower. And that's usually corporate or governmental. You've probably heard of corporate bonds or government bonds. These essentially work as more fixed income investments. So I had to introduce index fund investing. So like I said on the previous slide, index funds are a portfolio of stocks They're a type of mutual fund, but they are designed to mimic the composition and performance of a financial market index, such as Dow Jones, S&P 500, or NASDAQ. If any of you have worked with me and have seen me check my Apple Watch during the day, it wasn't because I was checking the time or things were happening too slowly. It was probably that I was tracking the S&P 500. The advantage to these funds is that they have lower expenses and fees due to being passively managed funds. They seek to match the risk and return of the market based on the theory that in the long term, the market will outperform any single investment. This is a long-term investing strategy that is lower in terms of risk, which is why it is appealing for these retirement accounts. I mean, we're probably all, around the age 30 to 40, where, we have a long time before we're planning on retiring. So these are all long-term strategies that we need to look for. I know index fund investing may not be as interesting as the meme stocks such as GME or BBBY that's happening right now, but with a return of almost 10% on average yearly over the last 10 years, you can't ignore index fund investing. And specifically, that is the performance of the S&P 500 over the last 30 years, 10% on average. Now we'll shift from individual retirement accounts to 401ks or 403bs. Really, the only difference between a 401k and 403b is just who the employer is, what type of employer, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever. So these are employer-sponsored retirement plans. So what happens is that you, the employee, will contribute a certain amount of your salary in what is called a salary deferral. And this is usually done pre-tax. And then your employer can match whatever amount you put in. These contributions are then put into an account, invested, grow over time, and can be withdrawn when you are retirement age. The advantages are that these are tax deferred accounts, like I was explaining in the slide previously. So pre-tax contributions, but they are taxed as income when withdrawing. So your tax benefit happens when you put the money in, because then it lowers your taxable income. If your employer matches, you should take advantage of this. This is free money. And I tell this to everyone. At least when I worked at Upstate, they give you 8% of your state salary, and they only required a contribution of 3.5 to 4.5%. So that's better than a match because they give you almost double. My current employer does a 4% match, which is still 4% of your salary that is handed to you for just being responsible and saving for retirement. The limits for these accounts are much higher than your IRAs. If you remember, I was saying that IRAs max out at $6,000 a year, $7,000 if you're 50 or above. For 401ks, 403bs, it's $20,500 for those less than 50. And then there's, again, a catch-up contribution up to $27K for those 50 and older. Unlike an IRA, though, you can't choose any fund to invest in. Your employer will give you a list of funds that you can choose from. My advice is to choose low-cost index funds if they're offered, as these would give really good diversification at very low cost. Your stock to bond ratio is very important. And what this means is that the percentage of your holdings are stocks, and how much of it is bonds, is what percentage is stocks and what percentage is bonds. Bonds are generally considered stable income. And so you should own a higher percentage of these when you are closer to retirement, since you don't want to risk a large proportion of your nest egg to market volatility. I actually adjusted my dad's holdings. So I'm in charge of his portfolio. And at one point he was holding almost 100% in stocks, and he was almost 65 at the time. Since then, I have shifted his portfolio to about 40% bonds, 60% stocks, which has protected him more from market ups and downs. And actually, the current downturn in the market, he's been telling me that he hasn't been losing as much as he's used to losing whenever he used to deal with having 100% in stocks and a market downturn. The final option I've listed, though, is a target date fund, which does everything that I've just explained automatically. All you have to do is pick a fund around the year you'd like to retire, and the fund automatically adjusts your stock to bond ratio to make it more stable as you get closer to your target retirement date. I recommend this frequently to those who would rather set their account and completely forget it exists. When you withdraw your money after 59 and a half, it is taxed as income. There is a 10% penalty if you try to withdraw before that, and you pay taxes on the money when you withdraw it. So really, you do not want to be taking money out of these accounts before you turn 59 and a half. Also, there are required minimum distributions, or RMDs, which start at age 72. And so these are mandatory withdrawals once you reach this age. So this slide is more for the attendings, a little bit more advanced info. As attendings, your contributions should be maxed. There's really no excuse to not max your contributions as an attending. Remember, if you think back to the slide on target savings rate, 18 to 20% of a $200K salary is way more than $20,500. If you find that you are not able to max your 401K or 403B contributions, you should take a closer look at your budget and cut down where possible. But there are small details that many miss about their accounts. Many employers offer an option to make some of the contributions after tax. And this is what's called a mega backdoor Roth. I know it's getting even crazier here. So a mega backdoor Roth is separate from your Roth IRA or your backdoor Roth IRA, but the money functions similarly. When you have the word Roth, you're talking after-tax money, no taxes on withdrawal. The only difference is that there is a higher 25.5K contribution limit versus the 6,000 or 7,000 for an IRA. And another difference is that you're also limited to the investment offers or options in your employer's plan. So unlike a Roth IRA, you can't invest in everything or anything. It has to be something in your employer's plan for this. If you elect to make all of your contributions Roth, you can have a very large nest egg of tax-free dollars in the future. And when I was talking earlier about the $1 to $3 million in a Roth IRA, you can have much more in this account if your employer does this for you, if you want it tax-free. This slide's also for the attendings here. A 457 plan is much like a 401K or 403B in that it's an employer-sponsored tax benefit retirement account. Employers that offer it allow an additional $20,500 or $27,000 to be contributed to retirement with the same benefits as 401K or 403B. So if you total all of that up, if depending on how much you're making, if you can spare to have, $54,000 total, if you're above the age of 50, then this is a great option to help you get there. Most often, these are also tax deferred accounts. So they operate with pre-tax money, and then you pay taxes when you withdraw the money. And so I think we've made it towards the end here. Here are some take-home points. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope it was mostly helpful. So just to summarize, make a budget and stick to it, pay down your debt, consider buying disability and life insurance before the end of residency, and save for retirement using a Roth IRA and your employer-sponsored 401k or 403b. A couple of resources here. A lot of the information here is covered under White Coat Investor. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. It's a great starting point to learn anything finance related for physicians. They have a great website. They have a lot of topics and blogs and everything, but they also have a book and a podcast. So I recommend those highly. And then there are also many helpful sites that specialize in financial explanations, such as Investopedia, where you can quickly look up any term you may not recognize. I spent a lot of time going through both of these websites. So I'd like to thank Mike Kuhn and Ali Khan, who were my original faculty mentors when I first gave this presentation, and who are both now my colleagues at Family Care Medical Group. And another special thanks to Dr. Gambier, who helped organize this webinar and has been a mentor to me for many years now. And thank you to NYACP for allowing me to give this talk. And so I see that there are some things in the chat here, and I will start to answer things here.
That was an amazing presentation, Josh. Thank you so much. Yep, we have open floor for questions. Anybody has any questions or comments or something to say to Josh, please feel free to raise your hand and then unmute, because we have few participants, many people, so that we don't are speaking of each other.
Well, I'll pop in as a reminder to everybody. We did record this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much. And it'll be hosted on the New York Chapter ACP's website under the resources and chapter webinars tab. So feel free to go there if you want to share with any of your colleagues. So.
So the difference in disability insurance as an attending as opposed to in residency, other than the cost, is really just how much the benefit is. So in residency, so the way to think about disability insurance is that it should be able to replace the income you would be otherwise earning. And so obviously while you're in residency, you're probably net like $3,500 to $5,000 a month. So that's all you have to really pay for. And no, it's not typically offered by residency program. I mean, usually you'll have a group plan for that. The issue, again, with the group plans is that they usually have looser definitions of disability. They will find a way to try to not pay you, essentially. So that's the nice thing about having a plan, an individual plan, is that they usually have much stricter definitions of disability and make sure that if you are unable to work, they will pay you. And same thing with attendings as your employers, you have to look to see what kind of disability insurance they're offering. Their group plans may be okay if you look into it. But usually you can find some holes and would be better off going with an individual disability plan. I actually just got my benefits package from my employer, and I actually opted out of disability insurance. I opted out of life insurance because I have all of that stuff on my own individual plans, which are much better than the typical group plans. Anderson saying, Oh, the other things that can be done with whole life insurance. Yeah, so you can obtain a loan against the policy. You can borrow against it. Usually, I just checked my life insurance plan a couple of nights ago. I think if I borrow a loan against it, it's going to be like a 5% interest loan. It's good. It's good if you can't find a better personal loan. A lot of times personal loans can have higher interest rates, so sometimes that's a good option. The issue is that you have to pay it back. Otherwise, your cash value in the in your account, drops, and obviously it's only 1 to 2% gain a year, which is very slow. So to be honest, I really don't recommend whole life very often. A term life plan is much cheaper. It covers you for, you can buy $1 million of death benefit for not that much money. And that will help support your family or whoever else needs your income. Anish. Yeah, so 457, it's not that 457 isn't for residents. I'm sure if I asked HR or payroll or benefits while I was a resident, I'm sure they would have said yes, but they probably would have laughed at me because I definitely don't make enough to have enough to contribute to a 457. So that is why I say it's for attendings, because usually a 457 comes in after you've already maxed out a 401k or a 403b, which is already $21,000. And I couldn't spare that with a $60,000 salary. Let's see. It works the same way, Hanish, though. It works the same.
This is great. Thank you everyone for joining for the evening. We appreciate your engagement and time. And again, thank you, Josh, for giving an excellent webinar. As Karen said, this will be available on NYACP website, and we'll also make sure this is available as a PDF file, as a document. And have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.